In this video, we're going to go over 5 very simple steps that you can follow to maximize the setup and execution of your seated leg curl. So first things first, just to orient ourselves, these are 2 different phases of the same person doing the exercise. This pad down here, this red dot here, represents the pad that you're shoving against on the back side of your shin. This one represents the thigh pad and the handles that often extend upward from there. Obviously, this stick figure person is the person in both of these instances, and the blue represents the seat. Okay, so 2 different phases of the same person doing this exercise, and it'll become very clear why we're looking at 2 phases instead of just one in a couple of steps. So step number 1 is to make sure that this thigh pad is in the right position, right? Because where this thigh pad is essentially is going to indicate where the seat is, and then also where this shin pad ends up. So we want the thigh pad to be as low on the femur as possible, right, on the lower portions of the quads, without it actually starting to rub up onto or against the kneecap, right, the patella. So as low as possible on the quads, right? And that's basically just so that it has a really long distance to be able to hold that femur down. If you put the thigh pad like halfway up the femur, then you're going to have a much more difficult time actually stabilizing the motion and executing it properly. So that's step 1, is make sure the thigh pad is in the right place. Step 2, make sure that the shin pad height is in the right place. A lot of leg curls have an adjustable shin pad where you can, essentially move this whole lever upward or downward for a higher or a lower starting position. And what is essentially going to dictate the appropriate height is actually not anything to do necessarily with where the shin pad is, but rather what happens to your spine as a consequence. So step number 2 is really focusing on the spine, and as a consequence, you'll figure out where the shin pad needs to go. So what does that mean? Well, in any sort of seated leg curl, because the hamstrings use the erectors to stabilize the motion, right? The erectors are essentially the anchor off of which the hamstrings can tug on the pelvis. We want the spine to be straight and rigid. And so what that means is that we don't want to sit someone down, whether it's ourselves or our client, in a position where they're really hunched over. You see a lot of people hunching over to get more stretch on the hamstring, right? Hunching over doesn't necessarily do anything to the length of the hamstrings. It oftentimes just ends up rounding the spine instead. And so we want a spine that is either in a neutral or a slightly extended position. So if you move this shin pad too high and the shin pad ends up being here instead, this yellow dot, right? This portion of the lower leg and the foot will end up looking something like this. And as a consequence of the leg maybe being too high, what happens instead of just, obviously your knee is not going to get pried apart in most cases, or at least hopefully not. What's going to happen is this is going to start to sort of round underneath of you, and you're going to start to just naturally tuck your pelvis, right? And that's going to take length away from the hamstrings if the lower back rounds, and it's also going to take mechanical advantage away from the hamstrings in terms of how much force that they're actually able to create. So we want this pad in a position where we can keep a rigid spine, but also where we can get our legs as high as possible to maximize the length of the hamstrings in that top position. So thigh pad number 1, as low as it can go. Shin pad number 2 essentially is essentially a reference in relationship to where the position of the spine is. Again, you want a good stretch in the hamstrings, but you don't want to be sort of rounded and tucked over. And then number 3 is going to be sort of an active arch before we actually begin the exercise to initiate the motion essentially before we start to curl. So what does that mean? Well, if any of you can think of just arching your back just a little bit, what you'll get the sense of is you'll get the sense that when you start to arch your back, again, if this thigh pad and the shin pad are in the right position, you'll feel tension all along the hamstrings start to sort of kick on with that arch. Again, it's very subtle, doesn't need to be too extreme. And what will happen as a consequence of that tension is your leg will actually push slightly downward against this pad. And so what you'll feel is a downward pressure against this pad. And if this pad on the thighs is in a correct position, you'll actually feel your femur shove up against this pad too. So what that arch and that initiation of the arch, again, very subtle arch, does is it essentially locks you into both of the physical constraints that you have to work with, right? So thigh pad number 1, shin pad and lower back placement number 2, and then number 3 is just a subtle arch to initiate pressure downward into the pad. Now, when you start to perform the execution, and this is going to get to the reason why I have both of these things up here, the execution is going to be different depending on the phase of the exercise that you're in. So once you have all that pressure down there, what you're going to notice is that toward the top of the motion, the shin pad is going to move downward and your lower leg is going to move downward, your foot specifically. So you need to be thinking downward at the beginning of this motion. And when that downward motion happens, much like how we initiated with that slight arch, what you're going to feel is a ton of pressure coming up into this pad. So your two references for the beginning of the motion are pushing the leg down, specifically the foot, right, and the heel downward, and in addition, shoving that femur up against the pad even more so than when you initiated the arch to begin with, right? So you want to keep pressure downward and as a consequence upward. But what happens as we start to move through this arc of motion, right? The whole arc of the foot is not just going to keep going down. It's going to arc downward and then kind of backward underneath of you. So what often happens is when people don't understand that the leg pad or the thigh pad or the shin pad rather needs to go back and sort of underneath of the butt, people end up just peeling their legs away from the actual thigh pad, this thing. And what that ends up doing is it ends up actually just starting to load things that are, we'll say, not the target tissue, right? We want to just load knee motion. We want to keep the knees still. We don't want the femurs moving off of the pad and all over the place to start to get other stuff involved. Usually people start to, use things like glutes and other spinal extensors to try to get the pad down instead of just the hamstrings. So when we get to this point in the motion, right, our intent at the bottom needs to actually be literally 90 degrees different. So look at this arrow and then look at this arrow. This is a 90-degree difference in the direction of that arrow from start to finish. So when we get to the bottom, we can't just be thinking down. We need to think down and sort of under us. I sometimes like to cue clients to bring their heels to their butt or bring their heels to the wall behind them. And now, because this is the direction of resistance, where are you going to get pulled? Where your whole femur is going to actually get yanked this way. And this is when you see a lot of people's knees traveling forward. So to prevent that motion from happening, again, that knees peeling away from this thigh pad, we should still probably focus on making sure the femur stays in contact with this. But in reality, what we need to focus on now, and this is why I put the hands up against this handle here, is we need to actually push against the handle to a significant degree. Now, I would also recommend pushing against the handle initially, but it's not remotely as important as in the bottom. So if you have to sort of change and focus your intent differently, in the beginning of the motion, you're focused on smushing the thigh pad up and pushing the leg pad down. But in the end of the motion, in the shorter position, you're focused on curling the heels backward. And again, to serve as a counterforce for you not to get pulled forward, you need to initiate some degree of motion with this sort of forward push against the handle so that you can then push yourself back into the seat. Because if you push yourself back into the seat via a push forward onto the handle, you're not going to get tugged forward to the same degree. Many of you may also benefit from using something like a seatbelt that will wrap around the back of the seat. And what the seatbelt does is it gives you an opportunity to sort of shove into it with your pelvis, right, or really the lower portions of your spine, so that you don't get yanked forward in this bottom position. Okay, so from beginning to end, there's a little bit of a changing intent here, and I'll just remove all these arrows so as to not muddy the waters here. In the beginning, we're shoving down, which shoves us up against the pad. And then in the end, right, in the short position, we're shoving backward, and we need to shove forward against the handle to keep ourselves back in the seat. And all along the way, you're making sure that you're not just getting rid of steps 1 and 2, right, where you have really solid contact against the thigh pad, which is on the lower portions of the quads. And then in the end, that thigh pad equivalent becomes that handle that you're pushing against. And if those things are in check, the entirety of the spine should basically stay rigid and fixed in that slightly arched position that you use to sort of initiate the tension and the motion. And from beginning to end, it'll just be 100% hamstrings, 100% calves to move the load. So hopefully that makes sense. If any of you have questions about the setup and execution, it can really just be this simple. Any additional notes or some additional comments that I would make is if you do find that the pad is starting to roll upward or down the leg, if anything, you want the the shin pad to roll upward on the back of the shin. So what that means, I'll erase this again, is that toward the beginning of the motion, you would want it relatively lower, like closer toward the ankle. And then toward the end of the motion, you may actually benefit, if it's like a cylindrical pad, you may actually benefit from it rolling up your leg because you tend to be weaker in the bottom position. Now, if it doesn't roll at all, that's perfectly fine. If it rolls downward, right, so if it moves lower on the foot, then make sure that you're scooting slightly backward on the seat, because if the pad rolls downward on the leg, that usually means that you're too far forward. And if you're too far forward, what happens is the arc of your foot sort of isn't in sync with the arc of the pad. And so if you scoot too far forward and you're way too far out in front of it, it'll just end up rolling down your leg, and it'll end up feeling really, really terrible and just not smooth because the resistance is not matched appropriately to your strength. So if anything, again, allow this thigh pad to roll slightly upward toward the end of the motion as opposed to downward. But if it doesn't move at all, that's perfectly fine, and that might be more ideal depending on the machine. So if any of you have any questions about any of the steps, any points of confusion, let me know in the comments, and I'm happy to address any of them. If you like this video and you want to learn more from me, please consider enrolling in my online anatomy and biomechanics course. The course contains over 15 hours specifically dedicated to improving your understanding of anatomy and physics and how it applies to lifting weights. Over 3,000 students have enrolled in this course and have reported back that it's the most easy to digest material that doesn't include any sort of boring textbook lecture that you might normally find in a typical college curriculum. So if you want to improve your ability to lift and as a consequence grow muscle more easily and reduce your pain in the gym, check out the link in the description.